My name is Evelyn Harper. I'm 38 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been described with words like steady, reasonable, and easygoing. I live in Portland, Oregon, where it rains more often than it doesn't, and where people pride themselves on being perceptive. Ironically, no one ever seemed to perceive me very clearly. On the surface, I was the dependable wife, the calm one, the woman who remembered birthdays, managed the bills, smoothed over awkward dinner conversations, and never raised her voice in public. I built a small remote bookkeeping business from our dining room table while supporting my husband's growing career. To outsiders, we looked balanced, stable, successful even. If you had asked our friends about me, they might have said, "Evelyn, she's sweet. She doesn't make a fuss," and they would have meant it as a compliment. But what people often mistake for softness is observation. What they call quiet is sometimes restraint. This story isn't about dramatic betrayal exposed in a single explosive moment. There were no shattered glasses, no screaming matches, no scenes that would make good television. It was slower than that, more subtle. A series of small fractures that eventually revealed a foundation built on deception. For a long time, I stayed silent about what I knew. Not because I was afraid, not because I didn't understand what was happening, and certainly not because I lacked options. I stayed silent because I was watching. Patience became my strongest weapon in a marriage built on deception. While everyone else assumed I was unaware, or worse, incapable, I was gathering something far more valuable than proof. I was gathering clarity. This isn't a story about revenge. There is no villain monologue, no dramatic takedown. What happened was quieter than that, more controlled, more deliberate. It's about what it means to be underestimated in your own home, about learning the difference between reacting and responding, about realizing that sometimes the most powerful move isn't confrontation, it's timing. I stayed silent about his betrayal until the day I had everything I needed to walk away. And when that day came, there was no shouting, no spectacle. Just a door closing with complete certainty. Have you ever felt invisible in a place where you were supposed to feel safest? To my husband, Daniel, I was the stable one. He used that phrase often, especially at dinner parties when conversations drifted toward ambition and risk. He would rest a casual hand on my shoulder and say, almost fondly, "Evelyn keeps me grounded. She's not into all the big, flashy stuff." Everyone would smile. I would smile too. What they heard was praise. What I heard was a limitation. In our marriage, Daniel was the visible one. He worked in commercial real estate. Sharp suits, expanding networks, strategic handshakes. He thrived in rooms full of people measuring each other's worth. I thrived in quiet spaces where numbers told the truth without raising their voices. I handled our taxes. I optimized our investments. I quietly corrected small financial oversights he never noticed. But in public, I was introduced as if I simply helped out from home. There's a particular kind of invisibility that doesn't bruise. It just settles over you slowly, like dust. No one intends to diminish you. They just grow accustomed to your silence. Daniel used to joke that I could sleep through a hurricane. What he meant was that I didn't react. I didn't escalate. If he came home late, I didn't interrogate. If he forgot something important, I filled in the gap without commentary. To him, that was easy. To me, it was discipline. Our friends often came to me for advice, though they didn't quite realize that's what they were doing. They would linger in the kitchen after dinner, asking quiet questions about budgeting or career decisions, or whether something felt off in their own relationships. I listened carefully. I asked measured questions. I never told them what to do. Daniel would later say, half laughing, "You missed your calling as a therapist." I didn't miss anything. The truth is, I was always watching patterns, not just in spreadsheets, in people. I noticed how Daniel's stories grew slightly exaggerated when certain colleagues were present. I noticed how his compliments toward me became shorter in front of women he seemed eager to impress. I noticed how often I was framed as the support system, rather than the architect of half our stability. None of it was dramatic enough to protest. That's the part people don't understand about slow erosion. It rarely arrives as a landslide. It comes as gentle reframing, subtle positioning, a shift in narrative. And I let it happen, not because I believed I was small, but I wanted to see how far the assumption would go. There is power in being underestimated. It gives you space. People reveal themselves more freely when they believe you are not a threat. Daniel believed I was loyal in the simplest way. Compliant, predictable, endlessly forgiving. He didn't realize my loyalty had conditions. Quiet ones. Internal ones. Boundaries I never announced out loud. To everyone else, I was the calm wife, the reasonable woman, the one who would never make a scene. They were right about one thing. I would never make a scene. But they misunderstood what that meant. Silence is not surrender. Sometimes it is storage. And I was storing far more than anyone realized. The first betrayal wasn't physical. It wasn't even undeniable. That's why it lingered the way it did, like a paper cut you keep running your thumb over, just to confirm it's real. It happened on a Thursday evening in early autumn. Portland was slipping into its gray season, and Daniel had invited 2 colleagues over for dinner, Mark and a woman named Lila who had recently joined his firm. She was polished in the effortless way some women are. Intentional, but not obvious about it. I remember the way Daniel introduced us. "This is my wife, Evelyn. She keeps everything running behind the scenes." Behind the scenes. He'd said it before. But that night, it felt different. Because he didn't look at me when he said it. Lila smiled warmly. "Oh, that's the dream. I can barely keep a houseplant alive." Daniel laughed a little too hard. "Trust me, Ev makes it look easy." I placed the wine glasses down carefully. "It's mostly systems," I said lightly. "Once you build them, they run themselves." Mark nodded politely. Lila tilted her head, interested. But Daniel redirected the conversation almost immediately. To a new development deal. To projected returns. To the thrill of risk. I've always been good at noticing energy shifts. That night, his face shifted every time she spoke. Subtle, but measurable. Later, when we were clearing dishes, I asked him casually, "How long has Lila been with the firm?" 3 months, he said. "She's sharp, really sharp." He dried a plate, avoiding my eyes. There are moments when your intuition taps you gently on the shoulder. Not an alarm, just awareness. That was the first tap. It wasn't jealousy, it wasn't an accusation. It was recalibration. Over the next few weeks, her name appeared more often in conversation. Lila suggested this. Lila caught that oversight. Lila stayed late to help finalize projections. One evening, Daniel came home later than usual. Not dramatically late. Just later. "Client dinner ran over," he said, loosening his tie. Lila had great input. Closed the gap on a negotiation. I nodded. "That's good." And it was. Professionally, it made sense. But something inside me had begun cataloging details. Not obsessively, not emotionally, methodically. The first small cut came 2 nights later. We were in bed. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. He usually ignored notifications after 10. That was one of his own rules. He reached for it immediately. The light from the screen illuminated his face for half a second, long enough for me to see the reflexive softness in his expression. I didn't ask who it was. I didn't need to. He angled the screen slightly away before responding. A small movement, almost unconscious. That was the cut, not the message itself, not even the secrecy. The shift, the instinct to conceal something that weeks earlier he would have shown me without hesitation. People think betrayal begins with a kiss or a confession. It doesn't. It begins with the moment someone decides to edit themselves in your presence. I lay there listening to the faint rhythm of his typing. My heart wasn't racing. I wasn't panicked. I was observing. He placed the phone face down afterward, an old habit he hadn't used in years. I turned off my bedside lamp and stared into the dark. That was the night I stopped assuming transparency. Not because I had proof of anything, but because I felt the first fracture in trust. And fractures, if you're patient, always reveal their direction. The human mind has a remarkable ability to protect the version of reality it prefers. After that night, I could have confronted him. I could have asked directly, "Why did you turn your phone away?" Or, "Why does her name sound different when you say it?" But confrontation requires certainty, or at least the willingness to risk being wrong. At that stage, I had neither. So I did what many composed women do when something unsettles them. I rationalized. He works in a competitive field. Late messages are normal. New colleagues bring new energy. You're being sensitive. That last one is the most dangerous sentence a woman can tell herself. Over the next month, the small shifts multiplied. Daniel began guarding his phone more casually. Never dramatically, never in a way that would look suspicious to anyone else. Just a subtle tightening of privacy. A slight pivot of the screen. A new passcode. When I asked about the passcode one afternoon, lightly, playfully, he shrugged. Security update from IT. We all had to reset. It sounded plausible. I nodded. But I noticed something else. His compliments toward me had become efficient. You look nice. Thanks for handling that. Appreciate you. Functional gratitude. Polite acknowledgement. The warmth had migrated somewhere else. At social events, I began to see the pattern more clearly. Lila laughed at his jokes a beat longer than necessary. He leaned in when she spoke. He positioned himself beside her in group photos without realizing he was doing it. No touching, no overt flirtation, just alignment. And because nothing was explicit, everyone, including me, could pretend it was harmless. One evening, during a firm holiday gathering, someone asked how Daniel managed such long hours. He smiled and said, "It helps that Evelyn's low maintenance. She doesn't need constant attention." The table laughed. I laughed too. Low maintenance. The phrase settled over me like a label I hadn't approved. What he meant was that I didn't demand reassurance. I didn't compete for his focus. I didn't question his whereabouts. But what I heard was this: she'll tolerate it. That night, as we drove home, I stared out the window at the blurred city lights. "Do you really think I'm low maintenance?" I asked calmly. He glanced at me, surprised. "It's a compliment, Ev. You're independent, not clingy." I see. And I did. Independence in his language meant emotional self-sufficiency without expectation. The normalization of disrespect is rarely loud. It's a subtle redefinition. You become the stable one, the easy one, the one who doesn't complicate things. And because you pride yourself on composure, you accept the framing. I told myself that marriages evolve, that attraction fluctuates, that I was mature enough not to feel threatened by a coworker. But beneath the rationalizations, something else was happening. I was no longer simply observing him. I was observing myself. Why was I minimizing my discomfort? Why was I so quick to defend his behavior internally? Why did I feel the need to be the reasonable one at all times? There is a quiet moment when you realize you've been participating in your own erasure. Not dramatically, incrementally. And once you see that pattern, you can't unsee it. I didn't cry. I didn't accuse. I didn't check his phone in the middle of the night. I did something far less visible. I stopped assuming his narrative was the only true one. And when you stop accepting someone else's framing, you begin reclaiming your own. He thought I was unbothered. In reality, I was recalculating. There is a moment in every long relationship when you realize you've been cast in a role. Not consciously. Not through a conversation, but through repetition. I was the stabilizer, the emotional shock absorber, the administrator of consequences, the woman who ensured nothing ever truly fell apart. Daniel didn't have to think about renewal dates for insurance policies. I handled them. He didn't monitor our cash flow projections. I did. When his parents needed help navigating medical paperwork, I became the quiet intermediary. In public, this looked like devotion. In private, it began to feel like containment. The more competent I was, the less visible I became. My reliability made me predictable. My composure made me safe to ignore. And Daniel grew comfortable inside that dynamic. One Saturday morning, I overheard him on the phone with Mark in his office. The door wasn't fully closed. "Yeah, Lila just gets it," he said. "She's hungry. She wants more than just stability." There was a pause. He laughed softly. "Don't get me wrong, stability is great at home. But you know what I mean." I stood in the hallway, holding a basket of folded laundry. Stability is great at home. I wasn't a person in that sentence. I was a feature, a structural component of his life. Something supportive, not central. That was when I understood the role I'd been assigned. I was the foundation. The background music. The reliable infrastructure that allowed him to pursue excitement elsewhere. Emotionally, intellectually, perhaps more. Foundations aren't celebrated. They're expected. And if they crack, people are surprised. Not because they cared deeply, but because they assumed permanence. Later that day, he asked if I could handle transferring funds for a new investment opportunity. Of course, I said. He didn't ask how my own client meetings had gone. He didn't notice I'd signed 2 new long-term contracts that week. He didn't realize my business had grown steadily over the past year, because in his mind, my professional life was an accessory to his. That night, I opened my leather-bound ledger. I've kept one since I was 24. It started as a budgeting tool, but over time it became something else. A place where I recorded not just numbers, but patterns, decisions, observations. I wrote a single sentence. What happens if I stop being the stabilizer? Not as a threat, as a question. I began mentally separating responsibilities. If I weren't here, who would handle this? If I removed my invisible labor, what would shift? There is clarity in stepping outside the role others have written for you. For years, I had taken pride in being indispensable. That evening, I asked myself a harder question. Indispensable to whom, and at what cost? Daniel came to bed late again. His phone lit up briefly before he silenced it. I didn't look at him, not out of hurt, out of awareness. He believed the narrative he had created, that I was steady, unshakable, uninterested in anything beyond our quiet life. He didn't realize that stability, when pushed too far, becomes distance. And distance, when chosen deliberately, becomes power. I was no longer reacting to small cuts. I was examining the structure of the wound. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen when I discovered proof of anything. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, in the quietest way possible. I was at my desk, reviewing quarterly reports for one of my longest-standing clients. Rain traced soft lines down the window beside me. The house was silent except for the low hum of the dishwasher. It was the kind of stillness I had always loved. Controlled, predictable. My phone buzzed. A calendar notification. Not mine, Daniel's. Our devices had once been synced for convenience. Over time, he'd disconnected most shared access points. But apparently, one reminder had slipped through. Dinner, 8 p.m., L. Just that. No explanation. No business tag. No location. Just an initial. For a moment, I felt nothing. No racing heart. No surge of panic. Just clarity. Because what struck me wasn't the possibility of betrayal. It was the intention behind the abbreviation. He had reduced her name to a letter, an intimacy disguised as discretion. I sat back in my chair and let the realization settle. Up until that point, I had been gathering impressions, behavioral shifts, energetic changes. This was different. This was deliberate. And yet, even then, I didn't confront him. Instead, I opened my ledger. I wrote down the date, the time, the wording of the notification. Not because I needed evidence for a fight, but because I needed evidence for myself. There's something powerful about documenting reality when you feel it trying to blur. That afternoon, I went for a walk. No dramatic music playing in my head. No cinematic storm. Just damp pavement and the smell of wet leaves. I asked myself a single question. If this continues exactly as it is, where will I be in 5 years? Not will he leave? Not is she better than me? Not how do I compete? Just where will I be? The answer came quietly. Smaller, more careful, more accommodating. Still stable, still composed, still invisible. And for the first time, that future felt heavier than the possibility of loss. When Daniel came home that evening, he mentioned the dinner casually. Client thing, he said while loosening his tie. Might run late. I nodded. Okay. He studied my face briefly, perhaps searching for suspicion. He found none. Because something had shifted. Not in him. In me. I was no longer waiting for confirmation. I was evaluating alignment. There's a difference between loving someone and choosing to continue building with them. That night, while he was out, I didn't pace. I didn't text. I didn't check social media. I pulled up our financial portfolio. For the first time, I reviewed it not as a wife, but as an individual. What was in my name? What was joint? What was exposed? Numbers don't lie. They don't soften truth or reinterpret intention. They simply show structure, and structure was my language. When he returned after 10, he smelled faintly of cologne, which he only wore for special occasions. Good meeting? I asked calmly. Yeah, he said, setting his phone face down again. Productive. I smiled gently, and in that moment, I understood something fully. I did not need a confession to begin preparing. The shift wasn't anger. It wasn't heartbreak. It was a decision. Not to leave yet, but to stop standing still. Patience had always been my nature. Now it would become my strategy. After that Tuesday, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been hopeful, cooperative, a quiet effort to preserve harmony. Now it was intentional. There is a difference between not speaking because you're unsure and not speaking because you're observing. Daniel didn't notice the shift. Why would he? From the outside, I looked the same. I still managed the house. I still asked about his day. I still attended firm events with calm composure. But internally, I had stepped half a pace back. When he mentioned Lila, I no longer listened for emotional meaning. I listened for inconsistencies. When he said he was working late, I didn't ask where. I noted patterns in timing. Tuesdays, Thursdays, increasingly on Fridays. Silence gave me space, and space gave me perspective. One evening, he came home energized, animated in a way I hadn't seen in months. He talked about a potential expansion opportunity, about risk, about bold moves. Lila thinks we should leverage short-term capital and move fast, he said. She's not afraid to push. He looked at me, perhaps expecting resistance. I surprised him. That could work, I said evenly. If the liquidity buffers are strong enough. He blinked, slightly thrown off. You think so? I'd want to see the numbers. He nodded slowly. Yeah, I'll send them. But he never did. Not because he forgot. Because somewhere along the way, he had stopped seeing me as a strategic equal. My agreement unsettled him more than disagreement would have. Over the next few weeks, I began redirecting my energy quietly. I expanded my client base. I opened a separate savings account under my business entity. Perfectly legal, perfectly transparent, but separate. I updated passwords, reviewed credit lines, requested digital copies of documents I had once stored casually. None of it is dramatic, all of it deliberate. Daniel interpreted my calm as acceptance. That's the interesting thing about being perceived as low maintenance. When you withdraw emotionally, people assume you're simply content. He grew bolder in small ways, more frequent late nights, more private smiles at his phone. Once, he stepped outside to take a call. He had never done that before. When he came back in, he said lightly, "Work stuff." I nodded. Of course. And I meant it. Because by then, I understood something crucial. Confrontation without leverage is noise. I wasn't interested in noise. I was interested in positioning. Silence, when chosen, becomes a mirror. It forces the other person to fill the space. And Daniel filled it with assumption. He assumed I didn't see. He assumed I didn't mind. He assumed I would remain the stabilizer no matter how far he leaned elsewhere. One Saturday morning, as he rushed out for a team strategy session, he kissed my forehead absent-mindedly. "You're the best, Ev," he said. "I don't know what I'd do without you." I watched him leave through the window. For the first time, I allowed myself to answer that question honestly. You would be disoriented. Not because you loved me deeply enough to grieve immediately, but because you've mistaken my quiet for permanence. Silence is dangerous when misunderstood. It allows the other person to reveal how much they rely on what they barely acknowledge. And I was beginning to see the full architecture of his dependence. I wasn't staying quiet because I was afraid to lose him. I was staying quiet because I was preparing to see whether he could stand without me. And I already suspected the answer. Preparation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. That's why no one noticed. Daniel didn't notice that I had started waking up an hour earlier each morning. Not out of anxiety, but out of focus. I used that hour to review financial structures through a different lens. Not as a shared future. As contingency planning. I mapped out everything. Joint accounts, investment portfolios, retirement funds, property equity. Business liabilities are tied to his name versus mine. I wasn't searching for ammunition. I was searching for clarity. There's something grounding about numbers when emotions threaten to distort perception. Every line item either exists or it doesn't. Every asset is either protected or exposed. And slowly, a picture formed. Daniel was bold in public, but careless in structure. Several of his newer investments were leveraged aggressively. Short-term gains built on optimistic projections. He thrived on momentum. I thrived on sustainability. I also began documenting patterns. Not obsessively scrolling through his phone, but noting timestamps. travel claims that didn't align cleanly, expense reimbursements that felt inflated. Nothing illegal, just lose. At the same time, I strengthened my own foundation. I secured 3 additional long-term bookkeeping contracts with small businesses outside our social circle. Quiet clients, stable revenue, predictable retainers. I consulted a financial advisor, not about divorce, not explicitly, but about asset protection strategies for self-employed professionals. The meeting was calm, professional. "What's your goal?" he asked. "Independence," I said simply. He nodded as if he'd heard that word many times. At home, my demeanor didn't change. I still hosted dinners. I still attended events. I still stood beside Daniel while he spoke confidently about expansion plans. But I stopped filling conversational gaps for him. When someone asked about our future plans, I let him answer alone. When he forgot a detail about our finances in public, I didn't correct him smoothly as I used to. I allowed small silences to exist. He felt them, not enough to confront, but enough to notice a subtle shift in rhythm. One evening, Lila joined us and a few others for drinks after a firm celebration. I watched her carefully, not with hostility, but with detachment. She wasn't a villain. She was ambitious, intelligent, drawn to momentum, and Daniel radiated momentum around her. At one point, she asked me about my business. "You work from home, right? That must be peaceful." The word lingered between us. Peaceful. "Yes," I said. "It allows me to see things clearly." She smiled, perhaps unsure what I meant. Daniel changed the subject quickly. He didn't realize that while he was chasing stimulation, I was building infrastructure. They saw a quiet wife. They didn't see the documents being organized in encrypted folders. They didn't see the legal consultation I scheduled, just to understand options. They didn't see the subtle transfer of a percentage of my business profits into a separate high-yield account under my company's sole ownership. All legal, all ethical, all strategic. Preparation is invisible when done properly. And here's the truth no one talks about. When you prepare calmly, you don't feel rage. You feel steadiness. The more structured my contingency plan became, the less emotional I felt about Daniel's behavior. Not because it hurt less, but because I was no longer trapped inside uncertainty. One night, as he slept beside me, phone face down as always, I looked at the ceiling and realized something unexpected. I wasn't afraid of losing him anymore. I was afraid of staying without choice. And choice was returning to me piece by piece. Daniel believed my silence meant trust. In reality, it meant evaluation. He believed my calm meant contentment. In reality, it meant readiness. What they never noticed was this. While he was testing emotional boundaries, I was redefining structural ones. And structure, once shifted, rarely moves back. The reveal didn't come with fireworks. No lipstick on a collar. No anonymous message. No dramatic confession. It came through numbers. It was a Wednesday afternoon when I logged into one of our joint credit accounts to download year-end summaries. Something small caught my attention. Not because it was large, but because it was patterned. 3 dinners over the span of 6 weeks. Same neighborhood, same price range. Not expensed through his firm. Personal. That, by itself, was not proof of betrayal. Colleagues eat. Friends meet. Adults have conversations. But I cross-referenced dates. 2 of those evenings aligned with the client dinners that had run late. The third aligned with a strategy session. Still circumstantial, still deniable. And yet, there was something else. A boutique hotel charges, not an overnight stay. Just a lounge expense. It was subtle, almost careful. Almost. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. Not in devastation, but in confirmation. Because here is what people misunderstand about quiet women. We rarely react to the first inconsistency. We react to patterns. And the pattern had just aligned. I didn't feel the cinematic wave of heartbreak you see in films. I felt clarity. The emotional ambiguity was gone. What remained was decision-making terrain. I printed nothing. I screenshot nothing. I simply documented the transaction details in my ledger. Dates, amounts, and descriptors. Then I closed the account window. The private reveal wasn't about catching him. It was about confirming that my intuition had been accurate all along. There is a strange peace that comes with that. Later that evening, Daniel came home distracted but composed. He kissed my cheek absently. "How was your day?" he asked. "Productive," I said. And it had been. He moved through the house with the comfortable ease of someone who believes the ground beneath him is solid. I watched him differently now. Not as a betrayed wife, as a strategist. Observing timing. Because here's what I understood in that moment. If I confronted him now, he would minimize. If I accused him, he would reframe. If I presented partial evidence, he would explain it away. And emotionally, I would gain nothing. But structurally, I could gain everything. That night, after he fell asleep, I sat in the living room with only a small lamp on. Rain tapped softly against the glass. I asked myself the most important question yet. What do I want? Not revenge, not humiliation, not even an apology. I wanted autonomy. I wanted to walk away, if I chose to, without scrambling, without panic, without dependency. The private reveal wasn't a moment of explosion. It was a moment of alignment between instinct and evidence. And alignment breeds power. Over the next week, I scheduled a formal consultation with an attorney. Not to file anything, but to understand timelines, asset division frameworks, legal exposure related to his leveraged investments. The attorney was calm, pragmatic. "Are you certain?" she asked gently. "I'm certain enough to prepare," I replied. Preparation does not obligate action. It simply preserves options. And options are oxygen in situations like this. At home, Daniel grew slightly more relaxed, as if some internal tension had eased. Perhaps the secrecy had become routine. Perhaps he believed the risk had passed. He even planned a small weekend getaway for us. "Thought we could reconnect," he said. Reconnect. The word almost made me smile. Because what he didn't know was this. I wasn't disconnecting emotionally anymore. I had already detached structurally. There's a difference. Emotion can waver. Structure holds. The private reveal didn't break me. It positioned me. And from that point forward, every choice I made would be intentional, not reactive, not impulsive, measured. I stayed silent about his betrayal. Because now I finally had what I needed. Not proof for him, proof for myself. Once you have clarity, indecision becomes a choice. The week after the hotel charge surfaced, I sat alone in my office and outlined 3 possible paths. Option 1, confront him immediately. Demand honesty. Force a reckoning. Option 2, say nothing and continue the marriage as it was, accepting quiet betrayal in exchange for stability. Option 3, prepare fully, detach cleanly, and leave when the timing favored me. Not emotionally, but structurally. I examined each one without drama. Confrontation would satisfy pride. It might even produce tears, apologies, promises. But apologies without structural change are a temporary relief. And I wasn't interested in temporary relief. Staying silently, indefinitely, that would require shrinking myself further. Accepting that I was foundational but not central. I had already glimpsed that future during my walk in the rain. Smaller, careful, diminished. No, the third option was irreversible. And that was precisely why it felt honest. Leaving quietly, with preparation, meant accepting the end of something I had built for years. It meant relinquishing the identity of the stable wife. It meant social fallout, uncomfortable questions, and financial disentanglement. It also meant self-respect. One evening, Daniel and I sat across from each other at dinner. He was describing a new expansion plan. Excited, animated, confident. "Timing is everything," he said. "If you move too early, you lose leverage. Too late, you lose the opportunity." I almost smiled at the irony. Timing is everything. He was right, but not in the way he thought. That night, I opened my ledger and wrote a single sentence beneath the previous entries. "I will leave when I no longer need to ask permission from him or from fear." That became my internal benchmark. Over the next few weeks, I finalized details. My business revenue had grown strong enough to sustain me independently. I adjusted client contracts to ensure predictable quarterly payments. I confirmed which assets were legally separate and which would be divided. I didn't move money recklessly. I didn't hide anything illegally. I simply ensured transparency would protect me. And then came the final confirmation. Not of his betrayal, but of my readiness. It was a small moment. I imagined him sitting across from me, denying everything. For the first time, the thought didn't frighten me. Whether he admitted it or not, it no longer changed my decision. That's when you know you've crossed the threshold. The decision point isn't emotional. It's structural. It's the quiet recognition that your well-being no longer hinges on another person's confession. One Saturday morning, he mentioned another late client dinner. I nodded. Of course, I said. Inside, something settled permanently. I wasn't waiting for more evidence. I wasn't hoping for a reversal. I wasn't bracing for impact. I was choosing the irreversible path. Not because I hated him. Not because I wanted him to suffer. But because I understood something clearly now. Love without respect corrodes slowly. Silence without strategy suffocates. But silence with preparation liberates. And I had everything I needed. Not yet to announce it, but to begin moving. Once the decision was made internally, everything became procedural. There's a calm that settles over you when emotion no longer drives the outcome. I wasn't operating from heartbreak. I wasn't reacting to his movements. I was executing mine. The first step was the legal structure. I retained the attorney formally. No dramatic declarations, just paperwork. We reviewed asset division laws in Oregon, community property nuances, exposure to business-related debt. I provided organized documentation, neatly tabbed, with dates aligned. She looked at me at one point and said, "You've prepared thoroughly." "I work with numbers," I replied. They calm me. The second step was logistical independence. I secured a small apartment across town with my business income. Nothing extravagant. Quiet, bright, functional. I signed the lease to begin in 6 weeks, enough time to finalize details without rushing. I arranged utilities in my name, updated mailing addresses for business accounts, shifted client communications to a private office box. Each action was invisible from the outside. At home, I remained consistent. I still asked about his meetings. I still cooked dinner some nights. I still showed up to a firm networking event and stood beside him while he spoke confidently about expansion strategies. He had no idea I was scheduling my exit around his quarterly earnings cycle to avoid unnecessary financial disruption. That's the thing about being underestimated. It gives you cover. I also began subtly disentangling emotional routines. I stopped reminding him about small, personal tasks, appointments, calls he needed to return, paperwork deadlines. Not maliciously, simply neutrally. If he forgot, he forgot. If something lapsed, he handled it. For the first time in years, I allowed him to experience the natural weight of his own life administration. He noticed the friction, but misread it. "Everything okay?" he asked one evening when I didn't remind him about a meeting with his accountant. "Of course," I said calmly. "I assumed you had it handled." He hesitated. "Yeah, I do." And perhaps for the first time, he realized how much he didn't. Meanwhile, I digitized years of financial records. I created secure backups. I ensured my personal credit was strong and unentangled from his risk-heavy ventures. There was no rush, no panic, just sequence. One night, as he slept, I walked quietly through the house. The living room where we hosted friends. The kitchen where I had balanced spreadsheets while dinner simmered. The office where he had taken calls, he thought. I didn't question. I felt no rage, just closure forming in advance. Patience had been my strongest weapon in a marriage built on deception. But patience without action is stagnation. This was different. This was a movement without announcement. 6 weeks. That was my timeline. Long enough to secure everything. Short enough to prevent second-guessing. Daniel, meanwhile, seemed lighter. Almost relieved. As if my calm reassured him that whatever line he was walking remained undetected. He mistook my steadiness for surrender. In reality, it was a departure. The most powerful shifts rarely announce themselves. They unfold quietly, until the day they are revealed, fully formed, impossible to reverse. And I was almost there. Consequences don't always arrive with exposure. Sometimes they begin with absence. About 3 weeks into my 6-week timeline, I started withdrawing in ways that couldn't immediately be labeled. Not affectionately, not cruelly, just structurally. I stopped anticipating his needs. When he ran out of dry cleaning before a presentation, I didn't quietly drop it off. When he misplaced a document, I didn't retrieve the backup copy. When he forgot a dinner reservation, I didn't call ahead to smooth it over. At first, he brushed it off. "Busy week?" he asked lightly. "Yes," I said, "very." And I was. My client base had grown. My apartment lease was confirmed. My attorney had finalized preliminary filings, ready to submit at my instruction. But the deeper shift was subtler. I stopped offering emotional cushioning. When he described tension at work, I listened. But I didn't overextend reassurance. When he sought validation about a risky decision, I responded neutrally. "What does your data suggest?" I would ask. It unsettled him. He was accustomed to my quiet encouragement. my instinctive balancing of his impulses. Without it, he began second-guessing himself more often. One evening, he paced the kitchen while reviewing projections on his tablet. "These numbers feel tighter than I expected," he muttered. I glanced up from my laptop. "They are." He looked at me sharply. "You've seen them?" I reviewed similar structures before. He waited for elaboration. I offered none. The silence stretched longer than he liked. It was the first time I saw something flicker across his face. Not suspicion. Instability. The stabilizer was no longer stabilizing. At a firm gathering shortly after, I noticed another subtle consequence. Lila's energy around him had shifted. Less flirtatious. More cautious. Daniel seemed slightly distracted. Less buoyant. Momentum requires reinforcement. And I had quietly removed mine. At home, small fractures widened. He began double-checking calendar entries himself, asking logistical questions he once assumed I handled. "Did we renew the homeowner's policy?" he asked one night. "It's in the shared drive," I replied. He frowned. "You usually just tell me. I thought you might want direct access." It wasn't cold. It was factual. The absence of invisible labor creates awareness. And awareness can feel like loss, even before anything official ends. 2 weeks before my move-out date, one of his investment partners called during dinner. The conversation grew tense. After he hung up, Daniel exhaled sharply. "We may need to rebalance some exposure." I nodded. That would be wise. He stared at me for a moment, searching for the version of me who would immediately offer to help recalibrate spreadsheets late into the night. I didn't. Not because I wanted him to fail, but because I was no longer responsible for protecting him from his own overextension. Consequences were beginning, not through confrontation, but through withdrawal of quiet support. And he felt it. He didn't know why the ground seemed less steady. He didn't yet understand that the architecture of his comfort had been built jointly. And I had begun dismantling my half, cleanly, legally, calmly. One evening, as we prepared for bed, he paused in the doorway. "You've been different," he said. I met his eyes. "How so?" "Just distant." I considered the word carefully. "Focused," I replied. He studied me, unsettled by the composure. He still believed this was temporary. A phase. A mood. He didn't realize it was a transition. And transitions, once complete, don't negotiate. The shift from discomfort to panic is subtle. It doesn't happen the day someone senses distance. It happens the day they realize the distance is intentional. That moment arrived on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Daniel was sitting at the dining table, laptop open, papers spread around him. He looked tired, less polished than usual. His expansion deal had stalled. Investors were asking harder questions. Liquidity was tighter than projected. For the first time in years, he asked for my help directly. "Ev," he said carefully, "can you look at this with me?" I walked over and stood beside him. The numbers were ambitious, overextended, structured on optimism rather than buffer. "You're leveraged heavily in the short term," I said calmly. "I know," he replied, running a hand through his hair. "I thought we'd have more flexibility." "We." The word landed differently now. He looked up at me. "You've always had a good instinct about risk." There was something almost vulnerable in his tone. Months ago, that vulnerability would have softened me immediately. I would have sat down, opened a spreadsheet, restructured scenarios, and protected him from his own momentum. But something fundamental had changed. "I think you should consult an independent advisor," I said evenly. He blinked. "Independent?" "Yes, it's important to separate perspectives." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument we'd ever had. Because for the first time, I was not positioning myself as his safety net. That evening, he tried something different. He suggested dinner out. A quiet place we used to love. "Just us," he said. "It feels like we haven't connected." We sat across from each other in soft candlelight. He reached for my hand. "I know I've been distracted lately," he began. "Work's been intense, but you know you're my foundation, right?" Foundation. The word again. I held his gaze steadily. "I don't want to just be your foundation," I said softly. "I want to be your partner." He frowned slightly. "You are." "Am I?" It wasn't accusatory. It was precise. He hesitated, a fraction too long. And in that hesitation, I saw it. He felt the shift. He sensed something moving beyond his control. Over the next week, his behavior changed noticeably. Fewer late nights, more eye contact, casual compliments resurfacing. He even left his phone face up on the kitchen counter one evening, as if transparency could be staged retroactively. But the difference between repair and reaction is timing. Repair happens when both people recognize the fracture early. Reaction happens when one person senses loss. He wasn't responding to betrayal. He was responding to instability. And it was too late. Because my departure was no longer theoretical. The apartment lease was active. The legal paperwork was drafted. The separation of finances was prepared. His increased attention didn't anger me. It saddened me. Not because I doubted his feelings, but because they surfaced only when his comfort shifted. One night, he stood in the doorway of my office again. "Are we okay?" he asked quietly. There it was. Not an accusation. Not confession. Just fear. I looked at him with calm clarity. "We will be," I said. He exhaled slightly, interpreting reassurance. He didn't realize I wasn't talking about the marriage. I was talking about myself. And I already was. I chose a Tuesday. Not because it was symbolic, because it was ordinary. Ordinary days absorb shock better. Daniel came home just after 6. He looked tired, preoccupied. I had already packed 2 suitcases. The rest of my belongings had been gradually moved over the past week. Documents, essentials, pieces of clothing he wouldn't immediately notice. The house felt staged, intact but lighter. "Hey," he said, loosening his tie. "You're home early." "So are you," I replied calmly. "I cleared my evening," he said. "Thought we could talk." "That's good," I said. "We should." There was no tremor in my voice, no dramatic pause. Just timing. We sat at the dining table where so many invisible adjustments had been made over the years. "I've signed a lease," I began. "I'm moving out." Silence. Not explosive, not cinematic. Just still. He blinked once as if recalibrating language. "Moving out," he repeated slowly. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I'm leaving the marriage." His face didn't register anger first. It registered disbelief. "Evelyn," he said carefully, "this is sudden." "No," I replied gently. "It isn't." He leaned back in his chair. "Is this about work? About me being distracted?" "We can fix that." I held his gaze steadily. "This isn't about distraction." A long pause. He searched my expression, perhaps looking for tears, rage, or accusation. He found none. "Then what is it about?" he asked. "It's about alignment," I said, "and the absence of it." He inhaled sharply. "If this is about Lila—" I didn't interrupt. I let him finish. "There's nothing inappropriate happening." "I know," I said calmly. That startled him more than an accusation would have. "You know?" he asked. "I know enough." Another silence. He shifted forward, voice tightening. "Why didn't you say something?" "Because I needed clarity first," I replied. "Not conflict." His hands pressed against the table. "You're walking away without even fighting for us?" The question was almost desperate. "I have been fighting," I said quietly. Just not loudly. He stared at me, and for the first time in years, he looked unsure. "You're my foundation," he said again, softer now. "And that's the problem," I replied. No anger, no raised voices, just the truth placed gently on the table between us. "I don't want to be what you rely on while you look elsewhere for energy," I continued. "I don't want to be stable without a partnership." His expression shifted, from disbelief to realization. "When did you decide this?" he asked. "A while ago." "You didn't give me a chance." "I did," I said softly. "Many times. You just didn't see it." He looked down, absorbing the weight of that. "I can change," he said. "I believe you could," I replied. "But I don't want to stay to find out." That was the hardest sentence. Not because I doubted him, but because I had already chosen myself. I stood. "My things are packed. The attorney will send paperwork this week. Everything is structured fairly." "Fairly," he echoed, almost hollow. "I don't want to hurt you," I said. "I just don't want to disappear inside this marriage." He didn't shout. He didn't beg. He simply sat there, watching the reality settle. The door didn't slam when I left. It closed with quiet certainty. The first night in the apartment was quieter than I expected. No dramatic collapse onto the floor. No tears soaking into unpacked boxes. Just stillness. I placed my leather-bound ledger on the small desk by the window. The rain followed me across town, tapping lightly against unfamiliar glass. Portland hadn't changed, but I had. The space was modest. Sunlight in the mornings, hardwood floors that creaked slightly, a kitchen too small for elaborate dinner parties. It felt intentional, contained, entirely mine. For the first time in years, every object around me reflected my decisions alone. The first week passed without spectacle. Daniel sent a few measured messages about logistics. He remained composed, perhaps still hoping this was a temporary separation. I responded clearly, respectfully. No hostility. There was no smear campaign, no dramatic unraveling, just distance becoming official. Something unexpected happened in that distance. I didn't feel bitterness. I felt precision. When clients called, my voice carried differently, steadier. Not because I was forcing strength, but because I wasn't dividing it anymore. I expanded my business quietly, took on advisory roles that required strategic forecasting, something Daniel once assumed I did only casually. One afternoon, a client said, "You have a way of seeing long-term risk before anyone else does." I smiled softly. "I pay attention," I replied. That was always the truth. Friends reached out gently, curious but cautious. "Are you okay?" they asked. "Yes," I would say, and mean it. Not because the marriage hadn't mattered. It had, but because I left before resentment could distort memory. There is dignity in exiting before you become someone you don't recognize. Months later, I ran into Daniel at a networking event. He looked composed, slightly thinner, perhaps more reflective. We exchanged polite greetings. "How are you?" he asked. "Good," I said honestly, focused. He nodded slowly, as if understanding that word differently now. There was no anger in his eyes, just recognition. Recognition that the quiet woman he once called low maintenance had always been measuring the structure of the room. I don't hate him. I don't replay the betrayal in my mind. What I carry forward isn't the deception, it's the lesson. Patience, when paired with self-awareness, becomes power. Silence, when chosen deliberately, becomes direction. I am no longer someone's foundation. I am my own structure. And here's the part that matters most. I didn't leave because I was replaced. I left because I refused to reduce myself. The difference is subtle, but it changes everything. When people hear a story like mine, they often look for a villain. They want a dramatic confession, a clear line that was crossed, a moment explosive enough to justify the ending. But life rarely arranges itself so neatly. There was no single catastrophic betrayal that forced me out the door. There were patterns, shifts, reassignments of value, and eventually clarity. I stayed silent about his betrayal until the day I had everything I needed to walk away. Not because I was weak, not because I was afraid to confront him, but because I understood something essential. Timing matters more than volume. Patience became my strongest weapon in a marriage built on deception. Not the kind of patience that tolerates mistreatment indefinitely, but the kind that gathers information, preserves dignity, and protects autonomy. I didn't expose him publicly. I didn't seek revenge. I didn't try to win. I chose alignment. And alignment sometimes requires departure. There is a quiet power in refusing to argue for your worth, in declining to compete for attention that should have been freely given, in recognizing that love without respect is simply proximity. If there's one lesson I carry forward, it's this: silence is not always surrender. Sometimes it is a strategy. Sometimes it is preparation. And sometimes it is the calm before a very deliberate exit. Walking away quietly doesn't mean you didn't care. It means you cared enough about yourself to leave before you disappeared. Now I'll ask you something. Not for validation, not for drama, but for reflection. Have you ever stayed quiet longer than you should have, only to realize later that your silence was teaching you something? If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts below. I read them. And sometimes, in other women's stories, we find our own strength reflected back to us.
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye!